Why is it not working the way it's supposed to? There we go. All right. How's everyone doing? I think I've got it set up. Hopefully you're seeing the screen that says Torah service.
Okay.
I'll just wait another minute and then we will get started.
Looking into them.
And a little.
Jennifer, good to see you. If you said anything, I missed it, but nice to have you on. Nope, I cannot hear you. Jennifer, I see, it says connecting to audio. It says you're muted now. Hello?
Hey.
There we go. Now it's working.
Okay.
The joy of technology.
I know, I was confused. I haven't done this in a while.
That's okay. You get used to it again.
Yes.
All right. Well, by my clock, it is time to get rolling. So tonight we're going to do a little bit more of a practical, hands-on kind of thing. Don't worry, I'm not going to make everybody sing or read Hebrew in public, but we are going to work our way through the Torah service. This is the section of the service that we do on Saturday morning, although there are many parts of it that will also show up on holidays and some elements which also show up on weekday Torah reading as well. But you're probably most familiar with it from our Saturday services. If you have a Sidur Lev Shalem, the Sidur that we use at Temple Israel, this begins on page 168. So if you've got a copy and you want to open it up, that's great. All the Hebrew and English sections that we'll be going over, I will have on screen. But if you just want to see where they are in your own copy, that's fine too. That goes too if you happen to have the PDF version that was sent out when the COVID crisis began. And good, got a few people on YouTube as well. So let's go ahead and get down to work. To understand the Torah service, you have to understand its structure. We don't just, as you've noticed, take the Torah out, plonk it on the table, and start reading. There is a whole ceremony involved in this. It begins with a fanfare. A fanfare is the kind of thing you might do when an important person walks into the room. In America, when the president comes in, we play All Hail to the Chief. Dun, 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 dun. If you are in a country that still has a king or a queen, they always blow on trumpets or play other loud music to let you know that the important person has arrived. This is very important in the Torah service because many of these elements were included at times when people were used to there being flesh and blood kings. They knew what sort of things went on. And by giving the Torah service similar styles, similar trappings to what would happen with earthly royalty, it helped put the people of its day in the right frame of mind to perceive God and by extension Torah as being something that was majestic, as something that was royal. You wouldn't expect the king to just stop by unannounced. You don't expect God to just show up and start giving you Torah without the proper introduction. And so the fanfare does that role. The removal then is our very formal and structured way of how we take the Torah out of the ark and how we proclaim about it. We then do the reading itself. there are then additional blessings. It's always been considered to be a very auspicious, a very good time to be focused on the blessings of community, of peace, of other things that we need while the Torah is before us, as the Torah is the vehicle through which we live, where we achieve these blessings. And then, of course, having finished, we're not going to just throw the Torah back in the ark. We are going to take time to put it back in the ark very carefully and with a great deal of choreography. We're going to go through each one of these separately and the different musical or liturgy that goes along with them. Everyone got the plan? Excellent. Excuse me, getting a spam phone call because why not interrupt when I'm trying to do something? That's what they're designed to do, right? So, fanfare. We begin with a selection of verses taken from the Psalms as well as from the Torah that bring together this notion of God's greatness, of God's majesty, so that we are in the right frame of mind. There is none like you among all the gods, my Lord. There is nothing like your deeds. Your kingdom is a kingdom of all eternity. Your rule is for all generations. Adonai reigns, Adonai reigned, Adonai will reign forever. Adonai gives strength to his people. Adonai will bless his people with peace. Now you can notice that these different sentences and parts of them are taken from multiple Psalms as well as the Torah in the book of Exodus. But when they are put together, when they are assembled in this particular structure, there is a running theme. We are, first of all, acknowledging God and that nothing is comparable to God. Certainly not other things that are called God, but that also means, of course, earthly people as well. And when we compare God's kingdom to all the kingdoms that we are more familiar with, we recognize that God's kingdom is not like all the kingdoms we are familiar with. Every king that is of flesh and blood, every kingdom that is made of stone will eventually go away. But God's kingdom, that is kingdom forever. Now, this is more than just a theological statement. This is more than just reminding us that God is eternal and that God is the true creator and Lord of the whole world. This is also a reminder to the Jewish people that even though for most of the time when this service was being said, we did not have our own king, meaning our own flesh and blood king, we nonetheless still had the best king, meaning God, God's self. That reminder was very powerful when we were often being persecuted by the kings of many other countries. And so comparing our king to the unjust and corrupt kings of humanity was a way of drawing strength, as we see by the end of this passage, that our king gives us strength, that our king blesses us with peace. And reminding ourselves, of course, that God is God is God. God has been king, will be king, is king, that God's kingliness is continuous. Does that structure work together? I'm not seeing any questions or comments, so let's go ahead and see how this works in the Hebrew. If you look here, this is the Hebrew from 168 at the top. And I need to sing it to you because the way the Hebrew works with the melody is very, very important. Ein kamocha va'elohim Adonai v'ein kema'asecha malchutecha malchut kol olamim u'memshaltecha bechol dor v'ador Adonai melech Adonai malach Adonai himloch leolam vahed Adonai oz lehamo yiten Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom. Those were the sentences that we read on the previous page, but notice what happens when we move to the next passage. Avarachamim etiva v'tzoncha את ציון. תבנה חומות ירושלים, תבנה חומות ירושלים, כי בך לבד בטחנו, מלך חרם ונישא, Adon Olamim. A striking contrast in the melodies. Remember the first passage, Ein Kamocha, is very up, very brass, very bold, very majestic. It is very commanding. It is exactly what you would expect when a king is coming into the area. But the second half, whoa, is completely different. This is soft, this is gentle, this is peaceful, which is what we just asked for in the line before, but most importantly, it is emphasizing a different aspect of God. The whole first section is dominated with the idea of God as Melech, with God's Malchut. God is a king, God is the one who is sovereign over the world. Whereas the second half, where the melody shifts, we move to the term Av, meaning Father, where we view God and try to relate to God as our Father. This contrast is what is coming throughout the entire Torah service. God as powerful, majestic, supreme Lord of all of creation, and God as personal and kind and caring parent to each and every one of us. But God is not only majestic, but God is also close and loving to each of us. And God is not only close and loving to each of us, but God is also majestic. Keeping those two elements together in our mind is something that Judaism wants us to have all the time, but it's especially important during the Torah service, when we need to hear the commanding nature of God through the giving of the Torah and the commandments that we have, but also to understand that these commandments were not given the way some rules by some fickle earthly king might give us rules, but these commands were given as a loving parent would give commands and instructions to their children. And so having these two concepts linked together is critical for framing how we will understand the rest of the Torah service. Any questions on this section? Again, this is all on page 168 of our Siddur. And don't worry if I flip past the screen and you wanted to go back and ask a question. This is computers. I can easily turn back the page. It's okay. At the bottom half of page 168, we rise up because the ark itself, what we call the Aron HaKodesh, is opened, and within it are the Sifrei Torah. But again, before we take them out, there is more that we wish to reflect on. And so we read this passage taken from the book of Numbers, the book of Bamidbar. When the ark would travel, Moses would say, "Rise, Adonai, and let your foes be scattered. Let those who hate you rout before you, turn and run from in front of you." Now, this ark is not our ark, meaning the ark that is referred to in the book of Numbers is, of course, the Ark of the Covenant. This is the large golden box within which were the Ten Commandments and other important things of keeping. And this would journey with the people through the Exodus and was, of course, the heart of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, the tent where we would worship. But it was also a symbol of our connection to God. Now, we don't have that ark. I don't just mean Temple Israel doesn't have that ark. I mean, that ark no longer exists. That ark was long ago taken and destroyed by our enemies. So why are we using it here? Because we are reminding ourselves that this ark, meaning the ark that contains the Torah and the Torah itself in particular, this is our connection to God. We may not have the gold box, we may not have the original Ten Commandments in their tablet form, but we do have all that was essential, meaning the lessons and the mission of the Torah right here in front of us in our ark. And that links us to everything that had happened in the past. For from Zion, the Torah comes forth, and the word of Adonai from Jerusalem. Again, for most of the last 2,000 years, most Jews would never see Jerusalem, and certainly most Jews did not have the ability to hear from Jerusalem Torah being taught. We do now. It's the miracle of the 20th and 21st century. But reminding ourselves that the Torah has come out of Jerusalem, and wherever we are and wherever we are learning Torah, that we are linked to that, has always been a powerful, powerful image. Blessed is the one who gave Torah to his people Israel through his holiness. Brings the passages to a conclusion as we then prepare for the taking out of the Torah. This section sounds as follows. Vayehi bin soa ha'aron, vayomer Moshe, Uma Adonai, ve'afutzu hoivecha, ve'anusu mis'anecha mipanecha, ki mitzion tetzei Torah, ki mitzion tetzei Torah, udevar Adonai mirushalayim, Baruch shenatan Torah Torah, Baruch shenatan Torah Torah, le'amo Yisrael b'kedushato. So with that strength and that sense of joy, we then turn to the next page in our Siddur. 170 actually in our Eitz Chaim. 170 in our Siddur of Lev Shalem. Come on. Boom. Why is there we go. Trying to move around my little screen of pictures and it's just getting stuck. So in olden days, meaning roughly 1,000 years ago, we would go straight from what we just did into the taking out of the Torah. However, it has become customary to recite a passage from the Zohar at this point. Now, this passage, there's a lot of debate about exactly who wrote it and where it came from, but in some communities recite it after the Torah has been removed, some recite it while it is still in. That is, interesting for liturgical scholars. What is more important is the content of how it is trying to focus us again on thinking about God correctly as we are about to read from the Torah. So this is written in Aramaic, and as we'll see, it is has content that is easily relatable to everyone. Blessed is the name of the Master of the world. Blessed is your crown and your place. Your desire be with your nation Israel forever. May you show the redemption of your right to your nation in your holy temple. May you fill us with the best of your enlightenment, and may you receive our prayers with mercy. May it be pleasing before you to lengthen our lives with good, and I, your servant, shall be remembered together with the righteous ones. Have mercy on me and protect me and all that I have and all that belongs to your nation Israel. You are the one who nourishes all and provides all with their livelihood. You are the one who controls everything. You have control over kings, and their kingdoms are yours. Again, reinforcing God as being the supreme ruler of the world, but also showing that we are turning to God at this time of the giving of the reading of the Torah to remind ourselves that it is through the Torah that these things come to happen. Right? The blessings that God wants to the world come when the Torah is implemented in the world after we have accepted it, learned it, taken it to heart, and put it into practice. But this section is not yet done. It goes on to remind us, I am the servant of the Holy One, blessed be he, as I prostrate myself before him, as I bow, and before the glory of his Torah at each and every moment. I put not my trust in any man, and I have no faith in the sons of gods. This B'nai Elohim is a bit of a complicated term. It can be literally translated as the sons of gods, which may have been a reference in the minds of some of rejecting Christianity. But B'nai Elohim is also a term that can be used as the children of the mighty, a term that was used for people who came from the aristocracy. that just because somebody was a noble or a powerful person, I don't put my faith in them. My faith is in God. My trust and faith are only in the God in heaven, who is the true God. His Torah is true, his prophets are true, and he abundantly performs compassion and truth. In him I trust, and I say, praises to his holy and precious name. May it be pleasing before you that you shall open my heart with your Torah, and that you may give me male sons, who shall fulfill your desire, and you will fulfill the requests of my heart and the heart of your entire nation Israel for good, for life, and for peace. Amen. So this has varied in a little bit in its language over the ages, but that final passage of saying, open my heart so that I may accept your Torah and do it, and so that therefore the requests of my heart will be fulfilled for good and life and peace, meaning that only the good things that are in my heart that I seek should be allowed to take place. Don't listen to the negative ideas I sometimes have, but instead allow me to be able to connect to what is best. That last paragraph in particular has become something that is sung with a great deal of enjoyment by many people, as it has such a beautiful melody for trying to open ourselves up to be able to receive the Torah. And it goes like this. Be'anarachetz velishme kadisha kadisha yakira anna emar tushbechan be'anarachetz be'anarachetz velishme kadisha kadisha yakira anna hema tushbechan yehei ra'ava kadamach detiftach libi behoraita vetashlim mishalin delibi velibarech olamach Yisrael letavul chaim velishlam. Amen. Now, why is this done in Aramaic? Well, there's a couple different reasons. One, Aramaic is the language of the Zohar. That is to say, the Zohar, the book of one of the primary books in the section of our library called Mysticism, was written in Aramaic, which is a sister language to Hebrew. Much like Spanish and Portuguese are quite similar in some ways, but in other ways very different. So too Aramaic and Hebrew are very similar, but not identical. Now, there are many different customs, as I mentioned, for this passage. Some don't say it at all. Some say it before the Torah is removed. Some say it after the Torah is removed. Some only say it on Shabbat, since the original is in a section about Shabbat in the Zohar. And some omit that phrase, sons of gods, because you might be implying that there are such things rather than rejecting them. So there are many different customs on that aspect. But once that part is done, one way or another, everyone agrees on the customs that come next. The Torah is removed from the ark, it is handed to the carrier, and then they are standing in the front of the congregation on the bima, and they lead the congregation in the Shema, a passage we call Echad, followed by another passage we call Gadlu. And then we march around the sanctuary, traditionally going to the right. The right hand always has preference. I just noticed we got some YouTube questions. I'm curious about Adonai Malach, right? So, and the connection to the Siddur about angels being a Malach. I thought "Not on mortals I rely" came from the Psalm. So, indeed, so a couple different questions here and comments. The phrases that make up that section, the passages in Aramaic we just read, have their origin in other teachings that have been reworked into that particular prayer through the Aramaic author of the passage. The idea of malach, however, is there is a difference between a malach and a malach. It's much like a what do they call those, homonyms in English. Sometimes in Hebrew you have words that sound very similar, or in some cases even identical, but they mean different things. So they are spelt differently, and one of course means an angel, and the other of course means king. And really, until we can sit down and I'll show it to you in the text itself, that might be the best explanation I can give at the moment. So, how does this actually go? That passage that I mentioned, the Shema, the Echad, and Gadlu. So, first line by the leader, then repeated. Second line by the leader, then repeated. Third line by the leader by himself, or if the congregation wishes to join, that is fine, but while facing the ark and while bowing towards the other Torahs that remain in the ark and are not being used at that time. The first line is, as you might expect, the traditional melody for the Shema. However, I should point out, as this is quoting the Shema rather than reciting it in the fulfillment of saying the Shema twice daily, we don't need to close our eyes or cover our eyes in concentration as we do at the other times. The only time we need to do that is when we are actually saying the Shema for its own sake, rather than as a reminder of one of the truths that we should have in mind at other points in the service. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Gets repeated. Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo. And repeated. And then turn to the ark, and as we bow, Gadlu Ladonai iti, uneromema shemo yachdav. And then we begin the procession carrying the Torah around. A reminder, we will not be having a procession this coming Shabbat, although we are again opening up our doors with all of our protocols in place to help diminish the spread of the virus. There are certain things that are not going to be done for a while. One of them is the marching around the room, as we do not want to overshare during this particular time of the epidemic. Then we get to the highlight, the reading, right? This is what we have been building up to. Having taken the Torah around and reminding everyone that they are connected to the Torah, now we actually get to open it up and use it. Now, this should be simple, but it isn't. It should be impossible, but it isn't. There's a lot of misunderstanding of what it means to read the Bible, and especially what it means to read the Torah. On the one hand, how could any document written in a language that we understand perfectly convey God's understanding of the universe? Right? It's simply inconceivable that all that God is and all that God knows of the world could ever be put down on paper. God is infinite, expression is finite. God is infinite, language is finite. God's knowledge is infinite. The Torah has a beginning and an end. It is not infinite. Therefore, it seems to be almost an impossible task to try and catch a glimpse of what God wants us to know. However, the Torah does perfectly convey the clearest statement of God's will possible in human language. One of the reasons why we continue to read in Hebrew is that we believe that there are nuances and insights that come from that particular language and that structure of God's revelation that are lost in translation. That doesn't mean we don't like translations. Translations are fine, they are helpful, and they are a great tool, especially if you don't know Hebrew all so well. But recognize that we are doing the best we can when we use the Hebrew, as that was the language that was chosen for the revelation. Now, God is perfect, so we might imagine that therefore his perfection in authorship would allow for a perfectly clear and unambiguous reading of the Torah. But this understanding, meaning God's clearest statement into the Hebrew, is not simple or self-evident because we're human, right? It requires a great deal of time and effort by the reader. It is easy to make mistakes when trying to grasp the full meaning of the Torah, right? Just because God said it perfectly doesn't mean I understand it perfectly. This is a point where many people, quite frankly, go off the rails. They say, oh, I believe in the Bible and as a perfect book. That's great, but you're not a perfect reader. And just because God wrote it perfectly doesn't mean what you think it says is what God wanted you to think it said. Now, I know that in some other faith traditions, they have this idea that if you read it with a full heart, any interpretation you come up with is somehow divinely inspired. Judaism says, no, thanks for playing. We want to hear what you have to say, but just because you read it with passion, just because you read it with devotion, does not mean whatever interpretation popped into your head has any validity whatsoever. It might not, which is why consistent study guided by the carefully crafted analysis of the sages and reinforced with vigorous debate can bring each of us closer and closer to understanding. We never rely entirely on our own understanding. We look to the chain of tradition that has helped us to understand, and we compare our understandings so that as we argue in civil and polite ways, the sparks from our different opinions will help us to see more of the light of Torah than if we just sat with one rock of our own ideas and refused to listen to any others. So, do we have a perfect understanding of God's perfect revelation? No, because we are human. Do we have a very good understanding of God's perfect revelation? Yes, because we are willing to listen to our sages, we are willing to listen to each other, and we are willing to continue to struggle to sharpen that understanding again and again and again. Any questions on that point?
No.
Okay. After the Torah reading, we then come to the Haftarah. Now, the Haftarah, which means conclusion, bears no linguistic connection to the word Torah. A lot of people pronounce it like it's Haftorah. That's a fine pronunciation. It's really more from Eastern Europe Yiddish pronunciation. But the word Torah means instruction. The word Haftarah, means conclusion. And as you can see on your screen, they do not have letters in common except for a couple little bits, right? Instead, the word Haftarah is connected to the word maftir, concluder, as that aliyah, meaning the final person who has the blessing over the last reading of the Torah, was added to ensure that the reader of the Haftarah would also show the Torah honor. Now, the Haftarah is a selection taken from the book of the prophets. Remember, way back in our beginning, the Jewish Bible is divided by the Torah, followed by the prophets, followed by the writings. The prophets are the ones you would expect, like Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and the others. But it's also the book of Judges, the book of Joshua, and the book of Samuel, and the book of Kings, which are considered to have been written by different prophets during those time periods. So we read from that time, from those selections, as a way of reinforcing the themes of the Torah portion, or of reinforcing the themes of a particular holiday that we are reading Torah on. So the Haftarah comes as a bonus passage. With two blessings before the Torah, we read before and after the Torah reading, one blessing before and for after the Haftarah, we end up then with 7 total blessings associated with the Haftarah. This 7, of course, is a symbol of perfection. It is a poetic metaphor. The main themes of the blessings around the Haftarah is the dependability of God's word as transmitted through the prophets, of course, with Moses being the chief prophet. Particular emphasis is placed on the promise of ultimate liberation, that we continue to remind ourselves that one of the themes in the Haftarot, in the words of the prophets that comes back to us most, and often we hold to most dearly, is the promise that eventually the world will be completely redeemed. The world as a whole will find its balance and will find its path in a way that leads to universal peace and goodness for everyone. It's one of the reasons the Haftarah is always such a emotionally charged section of the service. Question over here. I know the triennial Torah reading schedule reaches back to the early Second Temple. Where does Geft? I'm guessing that was supposed to be the word Haftarah, and autocorrect helped you there. So the Haftarah seems to have gone back very, very far, at least during the time before the year zero, where people would read from the Torah, and then people would also want to share insights from the Haftarah. There is a tradition that this may have begun actually as a loophole, as we were being persecuted by different regimes, and the reading of Torah was outlawed. Most often this is associated with the time of the Maccabees. And so rather than read from the Torah publicly and risk death, we read from the prophets publicly and read the Torah in secret. And then that tradition stuck around. But it has only been quite recent, by Jewish standards, about a little more than 1,000 years, that the selection of passages has become standardized. Back in the early days, 2,000 years ago, whoever was going to read for the Haftarah could choose any passage they felt was appropriate. But now we have a standard set. There is some slight differences between the Ashkenazic choices and the Sephardic choices. But that's a whole nother line of conversation. So after the readings, we then get additional blessings, most famous of which is Yukum Purkan. This first shows up in prayer books around the 1100s, but it almost certainly had been written before that as part of the Babylonian communities. Remember, these Babylonian communities were not part of the Empire of Babylon anymore, since Babylon had been wiped out 1,500 years prior to that. But instead, we still called the area Babylon, because that was what it was called when we first moved there. Much like people who live in certain neighborhoods often refer to landmarks that no longer exist after the new shopping mall was built. And this prayer focuses on blessings for all who support Torah, and there are older versions that specifically mention the political leaders and sages of the Babylonian community. We no longer include them because they no longer exist. Now, why is it written in Aramaic? Just like our selection from the Zohar? Well, there is another explanation. The Tosafot, who were medieval scholars, they say that the folk reason, the reason that the common people would share, is linked to the Kaddish, which is also written in Aramaic. That the angels don't understand Aramaic, so this way, Yukum Porkan, this beautiful prayer, wouldn't make them jealous of our praises of God. The Tosafot think this is a lovely idea, but they reject it as being a true explanation. Instead, they argue that the reason it's in Aramaic is because the least learned people knew Aramaic, even if they didn't know Hebrew. I know now Hebrew has become much more common thanks to the modern state of Israel, but back in their day, and certainly for the centuries before them, many people spoke Aramaic on a day-to-day basis, but they didn't always use Hebrew that commonly. And so by choosing to put Yukum Burkan in Aramaic, it's the equivalent in the modern world of choosing to read some blessings in English. It's making sure that it is as accessible to the widest possible audience within your community, because these blessings are ones that everyone should understand and be able to enjoy. Another very common blessing that's recited is referred to by its first couple words, Avinu Shebashamayim. This prayer is a prayer for the modern state of Israel. It was written by Rabbi Herzog and then edited by Shai Agnon in 1948 for the establishment of the new state of Israel. The phrase, the first blossoming of our redemption, Rishit Tzmichat Geulatenu, powerfully captures our belief that the state of Israel is the prologue to the redemption, but that the work is not done. There is some controversy, however, of whether or not we should see the new state as definitively being the prologue to redemption. And so the chief rabbi of England, Emanuel Jacobitz, he suggested that the words, may it be, as in, may it be the blossoming of our redemption, be added to make this a prayer rather than a statement of belief about the current situation. We in Temple Israel do not include his insertion. We say it still aspirationally. We cannot be certain for sure until Mashiach, the Messiah, actually arrives, but we would like to believe that, yes, at the moment, we are in the beginning. How long will that take? Well, I'll refer you to a text from the Rishalmi, from the Jerusalem Talmud. There was an incident regarding Rabbi Chia the Great and Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, who were walking in the Arvel Valley at dawn, and they saw the burst of the first light. Rabbi Chia the Great said to Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, "My rabbi, such is the redemption of Israel. A bit, as long as it continues, it increases." Meaning that you shouldn't expect that there would be instant light. Redemption from the world is not going to be like turning on a light switch, but instead, redemption will come piece by piece by piece, little by little by little, building towards a state of final completion. But we're not there yet. May it continue and may it speed up even. We can certainly hope. But it means that one should not be too quick to say there is no redemption, and one should also not be too quick to say redemption is done, but instead recognize that it will come in bits by bits. If anybody here has ever been out at dawn, I don't know how early you get up and whether you've been outside, but dawn can seem to come rather slowly, even after that first light peeks over the horizon. And then all of a sudden, suddenly it's light. So the redemption will be equally tricky to track. A slower process than we want to be sure, but continuing to illuminate the world in the end. Just checking if there's any other questions. Let's talk about the return of the Torah, right? Again, just like with an honored guest, we're not going to just show them the door. We have to escort them to leave our presence. Let them praise the name of Adonai, for his name alone is exalted. His glory is above earth and heaven. He has lifted up a horn for his people. Horn, by the way, is often used as a metaphor throughout biblical poetry, especially in the Psalms, as a promise of ultimate salvation. And figuratively, of course, to immediate salvation through the Torah itself, bringing us some measure of benefit and of fixing to our world by what we have just accomplished by connecting to the Torah. A praise for all his devout, for the children of Israel, a people close to him. Hallelujah. Remember, hallelujah is a Hebrew word meaning to give praise to God. And that sounds like this. Yahallelu et Shem Adonai, ki niskav shemo levado. Hodol al heretz v'shamayim, vayarem keren le'amo. Tila lechol chasidav, livnei Yisrael am kerovo. Hallelujah, hallelujah. And then we continue immediately into Psalm 29. Psalm 29 is used to mark the return procession because it emphasizes Kol Adonai, meaning literally the voice of God or the sound of God. This is linked to the revelation at Sinai, where we heard the voice of God. So by recognizing that we can still hear the sound of God, even without the Temple of Jerusalem, even without the Ark of the Covenant, even without standing at Sinai, we are saying that's what we just did when we heard the Torah. Much like when you read a letter that was sent to you by a friend or a loved one, you are hearing their words, even if they're not speaking sound waves in the room that you are standing in. Psalm 29 also links us to the idea that the voice of God is echoed in the Torah and the world around us. It also reminds us of the ultimate goal of Torah, that in this world, which is the bringing of peace, which of course goes back to our very first page where we say the final line from Psalm 29, that God blesses his people with peace. And then when it rested, he would say, return Adonai to the myriad of Israel. Wait, this is bad grammar. How can you say when it rested? You never begin a sentence with a pronoun if you have not introduced the pronoun. Well, we did introduce the pronoun. If you remember, way back about an hour earlier in normal time, we end up with our fanfare. Oh, up. When the ark would travel, Moses would say, "Rise, Adonai." This is from Numbers 10:35. And where are we now? Oh, come on. Keep turning for me. Feel like I'm paddling upriver. Where are we now? We are in 10:36. So these two verses are separated by almost an hour's worth of Torah study, but they are together in the Torah itself. So it's almost like we just took one long breath in between these two parts of the service and included the entire Torah reading in that middle. And that brings us to a conclusion, again, of having the idea of the Ark of the Covenant being symbolized by the Torah in the Ark in our midst. Advance, meaning to rise up, O Lord, to your resting place, you and your mighty Ark, your priests are clothed in the triumph, your loyal ones sing for joy. For the sake of your servant David, do not reject your anointed one. This is said afterwards, but usually quietly. And Radak, the great commentator, said this was said by Solomon at the dedication of the temple. So we are still bringing in these metaphors, linking us back to the temple of Jerusalem as we study Torah wherever we may be living. Oh, question over here. Is it always traditional to use a different melody for Psalm 29 on Friday service and Saturday service? No. There are many people who use the same melody for both. There are many people who have a rotation of melodies. It happens to be TI tradition to use two different melodies, but it is not a rule. And we do have some people who have a little more variety. Just checking my time. Good, we're doing fine. So that passage is started off together. Uvnucho Yomar. And then we continue the next few lines, usually privately. And as I always would like you to remember, you can continue privately in the language of your choice, whether it be Hebrew, whether it be English, whether it be Spanish, whether it be Russian, whether it be any language that you like. You are welcome to always pray in the language you are familiar with. We use Hebrew a lot publicly, but privately you should use the language you understand. And then we continue with the final passages that are giving us this conclusion. God chose to rest his presence on the house which was chosen through the merit of David. And after he chose Zion and established his presence there, he once again exerted his providence to maintain the house of David in the merit of the temple. As it says, "O rise, O Lord, to your resting place for the sake of David your servant," the passage we just read. This teaches that David's merit caused the divine presence to dwell in the temple. It isn't the temple that gives merit to David, it is David that helps bring the temple to Jerusalem. Again, it is us that builds the temple. It is us that builds God's presence in the world as making it known by the way we behave. It is not the other way around. And that is a reminder that as we are finishing with the Torah reading, getting ready to go back out into the world or on Shabbat into another part of our service, that we are that person that could be like David, that through our actions is helping to make God's presence seen more clearly in the world around us. And then we actually have the text. For I have given you a good teaching, do not forsake my Torah, taken from Proverbs. It is a tree of life for those who hold it, and its supporters are praiseworthy. Its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace, both taken from Proverbs as well. Bring us back to you, Adonai, and we shall return. Renew our days as of old, taken from Lamentations, the book of Echa, from which we will be reading during the day of Tisha B'Av next week. And of course, there are melodies to complete this section as well. Ki lekach tov natati lachem torati al ta'azovu Eitz chaim hi lamachazikim ba v'tomcheha meushar deracheha darchei noam v'chol netivoteha shalom. Ashivenu Adonai Tshuva. Chadesh, Chadesh Yameinu, Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. With that, the ark is finally closed, and we then continue our service. At TI, our tradition is to then continue with the sermon so that we have just a little bit of extra learning before we move on to the Musaf service, which is special for Shabbat. So that, in a nutshell, is the Torah service. Any questions? Checking YouTube, checking Zoom, checking YouTube.
Hey, Rabbi.
Yes.
You hear me?
Well, I'm
I
afraid.
chimed in late, so was that Shabbat?
Well, I was saying that was that how we do Shabbat service? Because I chimed in late, so I was pretty.
Yes, this is the structure traditionally for the Shabbat Torah service.
Okay.
For the Shabbat Torah service, exactly. By the way, I love your Union Jack. Reminds me of my wife. And my wife is
Represent, man.
very nice, very nice.
Thanks, man.
Any other questions on this section of the service? We will, from time to time over the next few weeks, have other portions of the service that I will try to share both the meaning as well as the music for them. I should point out that we are very fortunate, we are blessed to have the Sidur Lev Shalem, which if you read it in times when you're not actually praying, for example, when you're sitting at home, now that you have access to the PDF, you will notice that the margin notes on both sides have a lot to say that will help you understand even more than I could share during this presentation. So please use those additional resources, learn the depths of the prayers. They were not put together randomly. They are carefully choreographed to give us different spiritual insights, emotional effects, as well as educational points. So the more you learn about them, the more you will get from the service. With that, I will wish everyone a good evening, and please stay safe, keep studying, and see you soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi. You have a good night.
Good night.
Everyone have a good night.
Good night.